Kevin Lings is the chief economist at Stanlib, and we often use his material to show some of the graphs that he puts together on a weekly basis. But once in a while, as a financial journalist, you come across something that's been written in such a way as you feel that it needs a massive audience. And the piece that Kevin wrote yesterday is one of these. He used the foreign buying and selling of South African listed shares to point out how offshore capital plays such a critical role for a developing country, more so when, like South Africa, a big part of it is imports and exports. And he's going to tell us the story here, which is a story over 30 years, which explains it very clearly what we should be doing. Kevin, it's almost like I would have liked to have taken your article and sent it to all the schools around the country and just to read through this, because it's not conjecture, it's fact. The story starts in 1994 with a new South Africa. And you've used from there, looking forward, the data that we get for foreign purchases and sales of South African shares, which shows us how much the foreigners are actually interested in putting money into or taking money out of South Africa, to tell us a really compelling story about when we're doing badly and when we're doing well. But the good news, I suppose, starts with something called gear in 1996. Now, I'm paraphrasing your article. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but what exactly was gear and why was it such good news? And actually just tell us what that translated into.
Alex, sure. I'll give it a go. So if you go back to 94, there was obviously a lot of uncertainty around South Africa at the time of that democratic election. We in truth didn't know what the ANC's policy lineup was going to be. We didn't know what sort of path they were going to follow, what they were going to look to implement as kind of a first priority, second priority. There was a lot of uncertainty around that time, and foreigners reflected that uncertainty. Foreigners were not in any different position to South African investors. And so in the first couple of years following the 94 election, we were asking the question, so where does the government want to take South Africa? And then they released in 1996, middle of 96, a very important policy document, which became known as the GEAR document, and it stood for Growth, Employment and Redistribution type of document, and it was a statement of intent from the government as to what they thought policy should look like. And what was encouraging about that document is that it had many elements that the private sector bought into it. It spoke about the need for fiscal discipline. It spoke about the need to involve the private sector in investment, and it set targets actually for the level of investment, both from the private sector and from government. And it said fixed investment needed to go to 30% of GDP, that private sector had to have 20% of that, government 10%. It spoke about the need for infrastructure renewal. It spoke about the need for monetary discipline and keeping inflation under control. So all of those aspects were included in that document. And then it also spoke about the need to develop the social framework of South Africa, the social fabric, which was improve the electrification of houses, build houses, improve schools, improve hospitals, all of that stuff, very difficult to disagree with. And that document was...
Kevin, just before we go further, who put the document together? Because this is a blueprint that is very important for us to understand that. Was that put together by the ANC itself, or did it come from elsewhere?
So we feel that the origination of that document remains a little bit opaque, and there have been suggestions about where it came from. And one of those suggestions is that there were private sector lobbyists and private sector initiatives that were coming up with a strategy document that they presented to the government at the time to say, this is what we think you should go with and what the government should buy into it. Obviously, it was presented as a government document, and certainly Trevor Manuel at the time, very importantly, endorsed the document, and so did the cabinet and the president. But the actual origination there was an element of private sector involvement in that. Which part of the private sector remains up for debate, but there were certainly vested interests from the private sector urging government to follow these types of policies. And there were competing alternatives. It wasn't as if that was the only policy document that was around. There were other policy documents that had been put forward. The RDP program had been put forward, and they were more, if you think about it, more left-wing, more socialist, even communist type documents that were competing on the table. And obviously the private sector wanted to know which of these types of documents would the government ultimately endorse, and what type of policy would they follow. And in waiting for that clarity, there was a hesitancy in South Africa, a hesitancy by foreign investors to invest in South Africa. Local investors were clearly holding back, waiting for more clarity, which is, I think, logical. There's nothing wrong with that. And to the credit of government, they chose the GEAR document. They said, this is the path we want to follow. And it had elements of socialism as part of it, absolutely. But it had it as a balance. It wasn't an outright socialist or communist or anything along those lines type of document. It was a kind of centrist policy that put the private sector firmly in the space of needing to grow the economy, and it had a clear role for all the key participants. It had a role for trade unionists and what they represented and brought to the table, and so it was fairly inclusive. But importantly, it hit the right tone in terms of what investors wanted to see the government following, and because it was endorsed by the Minister of Finance and by the Cabinet, and it became quickly where the government wanted to take policy, foreign investors bought into it. Local investors bought into it. There was an acceptance that this is the route. And at that point, we started to see a very significant inflow of foreign capital, particularly into our equity market. And when I see foreign money coming into an equity market, it's always a belief in what's going on in the country. It's a belief that economic growth is going to be better. It's a belief that company earnings are going to get stronger, that valuations are appealing, that there's a future prospect. Very rare that somebody invests in equities simply for a day trade. When you're a foreign big institutional investor, you're not going to day trade equities. You're going to invest at least for a number of months and hopefully a number of years. And in order to do that, you're going to want to know that the economic backdrop is going to get better or it's going to stay positive. And that's what the document did.
Yeah, so for 13 years, South Africa had the GEAR document as its blueprint. And what was the consequence of that in the major matrices or the major data points?
So the consequence of that policy document and the consequence of having, quite frankly, Trevor Manuel as your Minister of Finance was that all of the main economic metrics improved measurably. And I think sitting in South Africa today, we forget that history. We forget that South Africa was on a very solid economic path, an impressive path, that over a 10-year period following the release of that document, South Africa's growth rate averaged over 4% GDP growth. We forget that. We forget that we were able to take the unemployment rate up from close on 30% down to 21%. I'm not suggesting 21% is a good outcome, but we were moving the unemployment rate unbelievably lower. Over a period of 4 years, we created 1.5 million jobs. We were able to take government debt from a level which was close to 50% of GDP, all the way down to 23% of GDP. Find a country in the world that was able to do that. The credit rating agency Moody's and all the other credit ratings took our credit rating above investment grade, and Moody's gave us an A rating. And as you look at almost every single metric, you could see the improvement coming through, and that South Africa was firmly on the right path. There were almost no aspects of this economy that were not improving. Income per capita was rising. And so South Africa was systematically being accepted as a key emerging market in the world economy. And as a result, we attracted a huge amount of foreign investment into our equity market. And when you think about it, that shouldn't be surprising because it represented a good prospect of future. You wanted to buy into South African equities because there was going to be better economic growth, better earnings, the valuation seemed compelling. And it was a broad-based buying. It wasn't if it was just buying into our mining companies or just buying into some of the dual-listed stocks. There was a much broader buy-in because there was an acceptance that South Africa was on a good path. It also helped us, obviously, that we had the Soccer World Cup being announced during that phase, and we were building up for the Soccer World Cup, and that gave us undoubtedly an extra boost. But I wouldn't attribute it to that. I think it was sound policies. We had Tito Mboweni at the governor of the Reserve Bank. He was managing the Reserve Bank exceptionally well, getting inflation under control. Remember, we had introduced an inflation target at that point, and Tito made it clear that we were heading towards the achievement of that target, and ultimately he did achieve that target. We also forget that the rand during that phase, yes, it depreciated, but the average annual depreciation was less than 2% a year. If we look at it more recently, it's extraordinary how much value we've lost, but the rand was a relatively good performing currency.
Kevin, we were a winning nation. We had this blueprint called GEAR. It was with private sector involvement. You've given us all of the data, and it's incredibly impressive when you look at it over a decade. But then comes 2009, and what happens then? Because I think that's the critical part of the story to see where we are sitting today.
So 2009, a couple of things happened, which are an unfortunate combination of three factors. The one is Trevor Manuel gets moved out as Minister of Finance, and he goes to the Planning Commission. And he heads up this Planning Commission that essentially sidelines him. He becomes less of a force within South African politics and ultimately disappears from the political arena. And that's a critical change, and I think a big mistake that South Africa made at the time. The second thing is obviously we went into the global financial market crisis, which was started in the US because of the subprime mortgage crisis. It spilled over into South Africa, and we had a difficult economic phase. It only lasted about 18 months in total, but South Africa went into a recession, and it clearly unsettled this good growth path that South Africa was on. And then the third thing is that we decided to oust Thabo Mbeki, and we elected Jacob Zuma as president of South Africa, and that changed the leadership and ultimately changed the cabinet. And those three things were the catalyst that put South Africa on a different path. Now, I think that two of those things we could have come back from. In other words, moving Trevor Manuel out, I think we could cope with that. I think also the global financial market crisis, we could cope with that. But once we had appointed Jacob Zuma as president, we didn't know at the time, but we were on a path towards state capture and towards extreme corruption in South Africa. And corruption became rife within that phase. And obviously, initially, I think most people were blissfully unaware that that was building up. We could see that the institutions were starting to become a bit dysfunctional. We could see that this economic miracle was dissipating. The data was systematically becoming disappointing. And to the credit of foreign investors, they picked it up very quickly. And they realized that South Africa was on a different path. And so they started this disinvestment from South African equities for the simple reason that the outlook was no longer what it was previously, that the growth rates weren't good, the earnings expectations from companies weren't what they used to be, the valuations weren't as compelling. And so they systematically started to disinvest from South Africa. And quite frankly, that continued all the way through up until today.
And what happened to the major data points during this period?
So when you look at South Africa's economic growth, instead of being 4.2%, we were now growing in the range of 1 to 2% with more regular economic declines. When we look at the currency, we find that over the next 10-year period, the currency was weakening at 8% a year as opposed to 1 to 2% a year. We found that the credit rating went from an A rating. Moody's took us from an A rating and they took us to 2 notches below investment grade. That's a significant fall off. We are now grey listed in terms of our adherence to all kinds of financial criteria. That's not a good outcome. We still, I think, in terms of the Reserve Bank, have adhered to sound monetary policy by and large, but you can see the fight they're up against. They're fighting a lot of battles, and it's becoming incredibly more difficult to achieve the outcome. And then, most importantly, I think government debt went from an incredible 23% of GDP to over 70% of GDP. And Alec, I calculated how much money was spent in that phase. So government spent all of the tax revenue, which was sitting, that it collected. So you collect all of the tax revenue over 10 years. That amounted to between 15 and 16 trillion rand that you collect, and you spent it, right? And in addition to that, you borrowed an additional 4 trillion rand because you're becoming a lot more indebted. So over a 10-year period, government spent a total of pretty much 20 trillion rand. That excludes all of the debt that Eskom has, all of the debt that Transnet and the SOEs have. They took that debt, they spent 20 trillion rand. And then I ask you with tears in my eyes, what did we get for that 20 trillion rand? We now have infrastructure failure that is very evident, not just the electricity outages, but the port capacity, the rail capacity, the water. If you look at the blue drop and the green drop report that came out recently, water and that quality has deteriorated dramatically. We're now deep into junk status in terms of credit rating with very little prospect of getting out of that. We've got income per capita that is perpetually declining, which means that our lifestyles are going backwards. We've obviously not able to deliver the social services, and we have regular social delivery protests in South Africa. And we've got an unemployment rate which has gone to a record high of 35%. If you've been generous with it comes to the calculation of the unemployment rate, and worse at a youth level. You look at all of these metrics; they deteriorated very dramatically. Yet we spent 20 trillion rand in that time period. And so foreigners have disinvested, understandably. You can't be critical of foreigners. They took their money and they went to other emerging markets that showed much better prospects. And the result is we've got an especially weak currency and we've got an underperforming economy. And now we want the foreigners to come back. But the message is clear. You want the foreigners to come back, you've got to have sound policy. There was this hope that Cyril would change all of this, right? That Cyril would be elected. And for a period of about, I looked at it, maybe 4, 5, 6 months, foreigners bought into that idea. They reinvested in South Africa. Not a huge amount, but the tide turned. But quickly foreigners worked out that this was more good speeches than implementation. And so the outflows resumed fairly soon after Cyril was elected. And subsequent to that, foreigners have been proved right. We haven't had the current leadership been able to implement the policy agenda. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with a lot of the policies, but we just don't have implementation. And so it just is a storyline that shows you, if you follow what foreigners have been investing or disinvesting from South Africa, it gives you a clear path as to when South Africa was doing well and when it was not doing well. And the message is clear. If we want to get foreign investment back, and we desperately need that, we have to implement sound economic policies and get this economy going much better than we're doing at the moment.
It's almost like in the olden days, they would take little canaries down the coal mine to get the canary. If the canary fell over and died, then you knew that the carbon monoxide levels were too high, and then the miners would leave. So foreign investment on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in South African equities is that canary in the coal mine. And what a wonderful sweep of history that you've taken us through, which really proves the point more and more. But Kevin, before we go, what is it looking like at the moment? What's going to bring the foreigners back into South African equities, and then perhaps be that canary that cheeps very sings to us, and our economy gets back on track as it was back in the mid-90s to 2010?
So I think that you've got a list of policies and let's call them reforms, regulatory changes, policy implementation that, if implemented, will make a difference. Now, to be fair and to try and find some positiveness, there are some developments that are a little bit more encouraging. So the obvious would be government steps away from the provision of energy and says to the private sector, you can invest more in renewable energy with very little limitation, and the private sector responds. If I look at how many projects have already been registered by NERSA, that's impressive, and the private sector is already investing and households are investing. And it tells you that if government can find its way to deregulate and get out of the way and step away, private sector will respond. I'm also encouraged by the president's office, the team within that office that are doing some regulatory changes and trying to get the economy going. And they're doing, to their credit, a quarterly update and giving us an idea of the developments that are happening. And I was on a call with them last week and I thought, wow, there's a nice list of improvements that are coming through. And the one to watch is the management of Pier 2 Harbour in Durban, which is the biggest container port in South Africa. And the idea from government is we're not going to give up ownership and control of Pier 2, but we want the private sector to come in and be an operator for that harbour and improve the efficiency. Right now, Durban is ranked as the 6th worst performing harbour in the world, and there are almost 400 harbours that are on that list. So this is extreme inefficiency. But government saying, if we get private sector operating in, maybe we can get that harbour to work better. And they say, if that harbour works better, we can roll out that initiative for Kucha in the Western, in Port Elizabeth and Cape Town Harbour. And that is the type of reform. Now, there are a few of these things. And what we're watching is, can we systematically implement those reforms and therefore inspire some confidence, inspire local investment, and then get the foreigner to see that South Africa's on a different path. Have we done enough so far? No, we haven't. We haven't done enough to turn it around. But you could paint a scenario that says into next year, you've got, let's say, less load shedding because you're dealing with some of the maintenance issues at Eskom, and you've got some private sector investment, and you get, let's say, a better electricity supply. Let's say that we start to get interest rate cuts next year, and we get global interest rate cuts, and there's a global economic upswing. That certainly helps to get to the South African economy. Let's say at the same time, you've got some of these policy reforms that lead to other types of investment after a lack of investment for a considerable time. If you think about it as catch-up investment, that would give you a little bit of growth. And just perhaps we can start to get foreigners to believe in South Africa. I think it's at the margin. I don't think it's overwhelming, compelling yet. I wouldn't shout about it as a turnaround story, but it's at least some positives moving us in the right direction. Maybe the election next year, we get more emboldened at a president level. Maybe we implement more changes. It's possible. The data, the history has told us we can do it. We've done it in the past. There's no intrinsic reason why we can't get onto that better path. It just requires that government focuses on the right things and gets rid of some of the baggage that has held us back for the last 10 or 12 years.
What a brilliant discussion. Kevin Lings is the chief economist at Stanlib. Thank you for painting that picture for us. I don't think there's any more mystery to what South Africa needs to do. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.